Hi everyone, my name is Connor Johnson, and in light of 2020 and COVID, I thought it'd be fitting to do my teaching demonstration on the Black Death and the legacy of pandemics from 1345 to 1353. Now, when creating a lesson on the Black Death, I thought it'd be appropriate to quickly get some terminology out of the way. The purpose of this lesson is disease, or in this case, the Black Death, is a disorder of structure or function in a human, animal, or plant, that produces specific signs or symptoms. To be clear, this is not a direct result of any physical energy or injury. It's purely contracted through either bacterial or viral means. Additionally, epidemic versus pandemic. An epidemic is a widespread infection of a disease within a community, and a pandemic is a widespread infection of a disease occurring across communities. Now, in today's world, a community would refer to a nation, most likely, or a state, where across communities would be internationally. In the purpose of history, however, a community could be defined as a village, or a city, or a town. It really kind of depends on what you're talking about. Now, to start this lecture off, I thought it'd be kind of fitting to begin with a story. And that story begins in the Mongolian Empire in a particular city called Kaffa, which resided on the peninsula of Crimea, the Crimean Peninsula, which is right below modern-day Ukraine. Now, within the Mongolian Empire, this takes place following the death of Kublai Khan in 1294. Following his death, the Mongolian Empire kind of fragmented into four different khanates, is what they were called. And Kaffa resided within the Khanate of the Golden Horde. Now, these khanates kind of competed for power, but they were all immensely strong. And within that, the city of Kaffa was a pretty unique case. It was founded primarily as a city for commerce. It was located in the Black Sea and had a very large and successful warm water port. It was originally founded by the Genoese, which was a Italian ethnicity that immigrated from the city of Genoa, which is in northwestern Italy. Now, the city, again, was a warm water port. It was very successful. It presided over a section of the Silk Road, and it also was settled along the mouths of the Volga and the Don rivers, which, if you don't know, the Volga and the Don go pretty heavily into Russia. So not only did commerce go along the Silk Road and along the trading port going into the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, but also went up into pretty deep into central Russia. Now, the reason why this city was pretty unique was it was given some limited independence by the ruling class, the ruling authority in the Khanate of the Golden Horde, which are the Tartars. And it was given that so long as the city was kind of bolstering their purses and their coffers, if you will. Now, tensions did arise, and that became problematic around the year 1346. And as a result, another city called Tana, which had also been founded by people of Genoese descent, there was a disagreement that broke out in a market, and we'll get to that here. So what happened was it started a riot, and in that riot, that escalation to a riot, accordingly, an Italian or a Genoese person ended up murdering a Muslim. Now, this is problematic for several reasons. The primary being that Islam was the prominent religion within the Mongol Empire. And the Khan at the time, Genghis Beg, within that Khanate, was so taken aback by this, and as a presided defender of Islam, he basically led a full-on Tartar army to encircle the town and laid siege to it. And he delivered them an ultimatum, them being the Genoese. They said you can basically leave and go back to Genoa, or you could pay full reparations, which had a few different things involved with it. But ultimately, the Genoese did not give a satisfactory response, and in true Mongol fashion, laid siege to the town and attempted to wipe the Genoese from the face of the earth. However, there were a few survivors, and they ended up fleeing to Kaffa. Well, irked by this, Genghis Beg ended up following them to Kaffa, and in turn led siege to that town. Now, to put some context to this, At this time, there were rumors stirring in the East of a mysterious force that was visiting towns and wiping out populations. This, of course, was the Black Death. And it just so happened that around the same time that Zhengai Beg ended up encircling and laying siege to Kaffa, the plague reached him. Now, this completely decimated the siege at Kaffa. Within a week, 40% of the siege was dead or dying. And as a result, there was a very particular odor and smell in the air that was infectious, and it was driving Zhengai Beg crazy. So as a result, he did a very famous example, what became one of the first examples of biological warfare. And he ordered the dead bodies and those corpses to be loaded up on catapults, and he catapulted them into the city of Kaffa. Now, these corpses were riddled with plague. They didn't know it was plague at the time. They just were getting hit by this mysterious force. And you have these bodies flying into the city, vaporizing and spreading the plague all over the place. And as a result, the city of Kaffa also got infected. Now, over the next few weeks, the siege ended up being completely dismantled, while the inhabitants of Kaffa were both getting completely riddled with this and decimated by it. And the only thought at the time was to escape. Ultimately, survivors from the siege ended up taking the plague back north, this being the Mongols, while the inhabitants who were desperately trying to flee the city were able to board ships in the port, ended up fleeing into the Mediterranean. Now, this brings us to the Black Plague. And by the way, this is a really fantastic primary source that was a drawing or a painting, of the Siege of Kaffa. And there's tons of information in here. It basically portrays just the dead rising up and just murdering everyone. And there's fire in the background. And it's a very intriguing primary source. Okay, so to transition into the Black Plague, or the Black Death, I think it's important to kind of talk about the rise of disease and the conditions that made the spread of this disease possible. The first was the transition from hunter-gatherer to agrarian societies, with people now committed to living in singular places and farming rather than being nomadic and moving around a lot. It made the ability for disease to take hold much more possible. And part of that was also due to population expansion within cities, and because agrarian societies being able to feed a larger number of people, you had populations expanding, and it allowed for the transmission of disease to become higher. Additionally, the creation of roads and trade routes also enabled this. Trade routes such as the Silk Road enabled trade routes, allowed the disease to spread in a pretty predictable but more efficient fashion. Additionally, holidays and tradition, particularly within Christianity in Europe, with mass numbers of people getting together, kind of also made the transmission of the Black Plague more possible. Now, to get into the spreading of the Black Plague, it primarily was transferred via fleas and black rats. The fleas attached themselves to black rats, which manifested in trading ships and along the Silk Road, and spread the disease from its point of origin somewhere in Asia, all across the Asian continent, into India, into North Africa, which then would transfer down into Southern Africa, and then across Europe. Now, the rats that transferred this disease had extraordinary reproduction abilities. To put in perspective, 2 rats that have been mating for 3 years could create over 3 million offspring, which is massive. They were also incredibly resilient. They could climb vertical surfaces, fit through holes a 1/4 inch thick, and can survive a fall from up to 5 stories. Additionally, they genetically had powerful jaws, which could cut through lead, adobe, and hardened concrete, which allowed it to basically saw into any of the walls and major building materials that were used in cities at that time. Essentially, the rats could get anywhere they wanted, and the plague was basically unescapable. And like I mentioned before, these rats traveled via trade routes and followed the stench of corpses. What also impeded this was the improper disposal of bodies. Oftentimes, when the plague was going through cities, it would wipe populations out so quickly that people were left with having to dig mass graves. Well, these would attract, the stench of this would attract the rats, which would help spread the disease further. Additionally, when the disease ended up reaching England, they were having such high mortality rates that mass graves really didn't work, and they resorted to burning the bodies. Well, at that point, the disease had mutated to be able to be airborne. So the burning of the bodies actually allowed it to commit itself to the air more, which further enabled it to spread. Now, to get into a little bit on why the Black Death was so effective at killing and why it was so efficient at spreading quickly, I think it's important to get first into the incubation time. Now, the incubation time refers to the time between exposure and contraction to the time when people first start showing symptoms. In the Black Death, that took roughly between a day and a week. This was particularly a big reason why it was so effective on spreading. At this time, people didn't have a really good understanding of what infections were, how they worked, what viruses, bacterial, genealogy, any of that kind of stuff, even medicine. They'd have a good understanding of that, so people would be contracting this stuff and they had no idea what to do. They didn't know they had it, and they'd be giving it to other people. Now, in terms of why this was so effective, or why this disease was so effective at killing, was because there was three main variants. There was the bubonic variant, the pneumonic variant, and the septicemic variant. The bubonic was the least lethal and was the variant that was contracted primarily through the rats and the fleas. It had a 60% mortality rate, and it showed in flu-like symptoms, high fever, fatigue, typically accompanied by bloody coughing, excuse me, and an odor. The odor was due to internal gangrene. The bubonic variant oftentimes would infect the digestive system, causing the different organs and muscles along the digestive tract to erode and decay, which is what where the gangrene comes from. The pneumonic variant was the second and the middling in terms of lethality. It had a 95 to 100% mortality rate, which is really high. It would almost immediately be accompanied with vomiting and coughing, and was incredibly infectious, particularly in the winter, due to its airborne element. In the winter, people would be huddling close together, they'd be breathing in close proximity, and that's how it was typically contracted. Finally, the septicemic, which is the most lethal and had a 100% mortality rate. Essentially, the septicemic would enter the bloodstream and infect the blood, and would basically force the body to go into shock and then shut down slowly thereafter. Life expectancy in septicemic was particularly harsh. After contraction, the individual who had the septicemic variant roughly had about 14 and a half hours to live. It was so bad that families who contracted this would say goodnight, and then one member would wake up to the rest of their family being dead the next morning. It was really brutal, really fast, and yeah, killed very quickly. Now, getting into the treatment of the Black Death, this is something I think is very interesting. It's quite medieval, particularly compared to contemporary medicine and our understanding. Again, you have to realize that these people did not have anywhere close to a modern understanding of modern medicine, treatments, approaches, anything like that. One of the more effective methods that did work with some limited capacity was quarantining. Particular examples would be Milan and in Poland under Casimir III. This was particularly due to the severity in their quarantining. In Poland in particular, if an individual showed any symptoms, him and his family would be basically barricaded into their house to the extent where they would actually brick them in. They would build an entire wall around every entrance and exit to that house. For medical treatment itself, it was primarily based on what was known as the four humors, which related to blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And in particular, those four humors related to basically impurities and improportionality in those quote unquote vials or humors in the body. So it was believed that the plague was causing imbalances in those humors, and as a result, they had different treatments that reflected that. The first was bloodletting. Bloodletting in particular was not effective. Actually, quite on the contrary, it helped spread the infection. You basically were releasing blood and popping these pores that were full of pus and all that kind of thing from the infection and spreading those bacteria everywhere. So that didn't work. The second was lancing. Lancing did have some limited success, but in other cases, they did the exact same thing as bloodletting. It just helped spread the infection quicker. The next approach, very similar. It combined both the idea of the four humors, but also the perception that the plague was an airborne miasma. And to treat this, there was two different ideologies. There was the pure versus kind of foul air. There was a belief that if a person was breathing in pure air or foul air, it would offset the imbalance or correct the imbalance created by that airborne miasma. So you saw two things. Either people were going to the countryside because they believed they would get cleaner air in the countryside, or, which was kind of interesting, and I don't know why people would consider this to be good, but they would basically visit the community latrine, and they would spend a considerable amount of time breathing in the air in a latrine pit, because again, the belief was that it would offset that impurity. Another thing that they did was the belief that drinking urine by people that were not contaminated with the plague, of course they don't know because it's a week-long incubation time, that drinking urine of people that were not infected would somehow give them immunity to it, which is interesting. Another one was fire. This did have actually some interesting effects in terms of preventing fleas. Fire is a good deterrent for fleas, and actually the Pope at the time, Clement VI, actually was noted to do sermons in mass, who would hold mass in a ring of fire around him, and he notably did survive the plague. So it's another little interesting little tidbit. At the same time, though, people were wondering why this was happening to them, and they began looking for answers. The first notably was religion. There's a big belief that the plague was the divine retribution for the sins of humanity. In a particular group, the flagellants, took this to a radical level where they would basically organize these mass marches across Europe, where they would essentially strip down naked and whip themselves as they were going in order to rid themselves of their impurities. And notably, of course, this didn't really work, obviously. The trails that these people took was very easy to find. There was blood all over the ground as they left and followed by bodies and that kind of thing. Another answer, interesting enough, was astrology. This kind of goes back to the ideas of Greek philosophy and those Greek astronomers, and even going like Galileo and those kind of people. This kind of originates from. But in Paris, there's a group called the Learned 46 Masters of the Paris Medical Faculty. And they proposed that the plague was caused by an unusual conjunction of Saturn, Mars, and Jupiter within a particular alignment of stars or constellation, sorry. And they even went so far as to propose an exact date and time upon which this conjunction happened and when this plague was released upon them, which they proposed was the first or the 1 p.m. on the 20th of March in 1345. Yeah, not a lot to, I guess, evidence to support what they were claiming, but that was their belief. And they ultimately said that the plague or this conjunction of planets created a corrupted air, and that corrupted air in turn corrupted the substance of spirit, destroying the life force within people. It's kind of an interesting medieval ideology around the origins of the plague. At the same time, though, while people were looking for answers, other people were looking to blame. And within Europe, which is primarily Christian, they reverted to doing something that they oftentimes did, which is blame the Jews. As a result, several pogroms against Jews were formed and took place across Europe throughout the years of the plague. One example is on September of 1349, all the Jews between Cologne and Austria were allegedly killed. Apparently Christians went house to house killing families because they blamed them for the plague. Another example, which is illustrated in the picture on the left, was the burning of Jews alive on mass grills and stakes at Brandenburg. Yeah, kind of horrid. Another kind of justification for it was in the population of Jews themselves. The Christian perspective was that um, Jewish populations that had a lower level of infectivity rate was ultimately because they were the ones that were perpetrating this, act of death upon them. So they killed them because, they perceived them as starting it. The other, which is a little bit more heinous, is the level of higher infectivity in Jewish populations. In that group, Christians decided to kill Jews because they see the plague as finishing God's work. Again, kind of vile and heinous. Overall, the after effects or the aftermath of the Black Plague resulted in the death of a third of Europe's population and ultimately 200 million people worldwide between Asia, Africa, India, and Europe, and ultimately it had a very interesting legacy. While during the plague itself, it really broke down the fabrics of society, the after effects actually suggest that Europe and the world as a whole was in a better state than beforehand. The cost of labor increased while the price of food decreased, which resulted in an increased standard of living for peasants. They were getting paid more by the upper class to do their work. On the other hand, the role of women was also in some cases evolved and more inclusive. A lot of men had died during the Black Plague, and as a result, women had to kind of step in to fill those roles, and as a result, their roles widened. But perhaps most significantly was the fact that the Black Plague resulted in a question traditional institutions and challenged science and medicine. Where before the plague, oftentimes efforts to understand just the world around people better often resulted in the perspective of heresy, particularly from the religious community. It was ultimately met with violence. After the plague, a lot of people were wondering, well, what happened? And as a result, efforts to actually begin to evolve their understanding of science and medicine, as well as the world in general, those efforts kind of evolved. And it's something that kind of transitions into big themes in the Renaissance, and then eventually really characterizes some of the ideologies of the Enlightenment. So yeah, it has a very interesting legacy that extends several hundred years past the actual event itself. Just to put into perspective, I want to place the Black Death within a timeline. I think, interestingly enough, the plague of Justinian actually was the exact same strand of plague as the Black Death, but just due to the circumstances that took place at the time of the Black Death, with the trade routes, the political institutions at the time, just the population growth, the state of the world, allowed for the Black Death to be as efficient as it was, where during the plague of Justinian, it didn't have the same kind of effect. It still killed between 30 and 50 million people, but it didn't have the same widespread effect as the Black Death did. By comparison, you also have the Spanish flu, which followed the First World War, killing between 40 and 50 million people. And of course, today we have COVID. I have a little bit of a typo. I meant to say 2020 CE, not 2012. But COVID has killed so far worldwide 1.53 million people, and that number is still climbing, sadly. To wrap things up, I just wanted to introduce a classroom activity that could be accompanied with this lesson. I thought a simulation would be really interesting. I think taking a class and having them take on the perspective of a town that was just infected with the plague, and then having them introduce different roles, so like authority, clergy, maybe some military, different peasantry, farmers, artisans, plague doctors, fanatics, and that'd be kind of a cool little idea for a class interaction. I think to help it, creating certain conditions, so like prerequisites for it would be necessary. Maybe different things that have happened in other towns, just setting the stage, that kind of thing. And then as a simulation continues, introduce new conditions to kind of alter responses. Maybe there's an increase of plague, or there's a mutation, or you see this other town did something that really worked well. Maybe they try that, but it doesn't have the same amount of success because of some other reason or something like that. Yeah, so that was my lesson. I hope you enjoyed it, and have a good rest of your day.